listen to it. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. So with this, a lot of people like to talk like this, and you can't even see it barely registering on there.
Right.
Check.
If everyone could please take your seat, we're going to get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the second day of the Commercial Space Transportation Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Babin, Chairman of the House Space Subcommittee. Dr. Babin is a lifelong resident of East Texas. He was born in Port Arthur, Texas, and grew up in Beaumont. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree from Lamar University and completed dental school at the University of Texas Dental Branch in Houston, Texas. Dr. Babin served as an airborne artilleryman in the Texas Army National Guard and the U.S. Army Reserve. Following his graduation from dental school, Dr. Babin was commissioned as a captain in the U.S. Air Force. Dr. Babin was appointed to the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology on January 5, 2015. Serving as chairman of the Subcommittee on Space, he is a national leader on America's space policy issues, and his district includes NASA's Johnson Space Center. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Chairman Babin.
Thank you. Excuse me. It's great to be here this morning. It's a great honor, and pardon my voice because it's kind of waning instead of waxing this morning. I just want to say how great it is to be here, honored and privileged to be speaking with you, distinguished folks in the FAA and our Commercial Space Transportation Conference. And this is my very first time to speak at this conference, and I'm very excited to be here. In fact, my voice holds out. The commercial space transportation industry is truly an amazing industry. It generates hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity, serving both the private and the public sector, all while pushing the boundaries of innovation and fostering the United States as a global leader in space transportation. I'd like to start by taking this opportunity to bring you up to speed on some of the work that Congress has been doing this past year in the for the space community, as well as what we may have in store in the near future. I represent the 36th district in Texas, which is home to the Johnson Space Center and 9 counties. I joined the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee last year and then was appointed chairman of the Space Subcommittee in June. In that short amount of time, we've gotten a lot done. We unanimously sent a fiscal year 2015 NASA authorization to the U.S. Senate for them to act on. We're still waiting, folks. We passed a fiscal year 16 and 17 authorization out of the committee that gave the Appropriations Committee direction on funding priorities. H.R. 2262, the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, was passed by both chambers of Congress and signed into law by the President. We enacted funding for fiscal year 2016, which significantly increased the budget for NASA above the President's budget request. On the oversight front, we've held 10 space hearings, including reviews of unmanned aircraft systems, the Commercial Crew Program, NASA's overall budget request, astrobiology, planetary science discoveries, private and public partnerships for NASA's Earth Observation Program, the International Space Station Program, and the impacts of the recent cargo accidents, and NASA's efforts to develop deep space exploration systems. I've also had the pleasure of visiting a number of space industry facilities and NASA centers where I saw firsthand the ingenuity and the creativity of our space sector. The private sector has always been a partner in our space exploration. From McDonnell Aircraft Corporation building the Mercury and Gemini capsules, to Grumman building the Lunar Excursion Module for Apollo, or the United Space Alliance operating the Space Shuttle fleet, contractors and the private sector have always worked hand in hand since the dawn of the space age, and the future will be no different. SpaceX and Orbital ATK now replenish the ISS through Commercial Cargo Program, with Sierra Nevada now joining them under the second commercial resupply services contract. SpaceX and Boeing are under contract to provide crew access to the ISS by the year 2017, next year. NASA is contracting with Lockheed Martin to develop the Orion capsule. And with Boeing, Orbital ATK, and Aerojet Rocketdyne to develop the core stage, the 5-segment boosters, and the main engines, respectively, for the Space Launch System, Blue Origin is now developing replacement engines for the Atlas V while developing its own launch capabilities, and the United Launch Alliance continues to propel NASA's most sensitive scientific payloads deeper into the cosmos. Virgin Galactic, X-Core, and Worldview are on the cutting edge of the suborbital commercial human spaceflight frontier. Rocket Lab, Firefly, Virgin Galactic's Launcher One are working to lower the cost of access to space for smaller payloads. Bigelow Aerospace, Moon Express, Planetary Resources, Deep Space Industries, Maston, Astrobotics, and others are revolutionizing the possibilities of what can be done in the space by the private sector. In his 1984 State of the Union speech, President Reagan remarked that our success in space is a tribute to American teamwork and excellence. He dared the nation's engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs to develop private sector space launch solutions with minimal government interference. Congress followed up on this challenge by passing the Commercial Space Launch Act, which served as a catalyst for the commercial space sector. Since then, commercial space legislation has facilitated multiple advances in space launch, communications, entertainment, position, navigation, and timing technology, weather monitoring, remote sensing, space tourism, science experimentation, and expanded human space flight. In order to continue this growth, we need to provide a stable, certain, and competitive regulatory environment at the FAA, the Federal Communications Commission, and NOAA, the National Transportation and Safety Board, that facilitate domestic investment and creativity. H.R. 2262, the Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneur Act, or SPACE Act, was the base legislation used to draft the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. It was sponsored by our majority leader in the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy. And I'm proud to say that I was an original co-sponsor along with our Science, Space, and Technology Committee Chairman, Lamar Smith. The committee spent years engaging with stakeholders, holding hearings, and drafting this legislation. The result is a law that facilitates a pro-growth environment for the development of commercial space industry by encouraging private sector investment, creating more stable and predictable regulatory conditions, and improving safety. The law ensures American leadership in space and fosters the development of advanced space technologies. The Act preserves FAA's ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight in order to protect the uninvolved public, national security, public health, and safety, the safety of property, and foreign policy. Similarly, the Act preserves FAA's ability to regulate spaceflight, participant, and crew safety as a result of an accident or an unplanned event. Thank you, Steve. The Act extends the learning period to 2023 to allow the FAA to gain data to inform possible future regulations or some other safety framework, and calls for a progress report on the status of the knowledge of the industry and that the FAA has gained. The Act also allows for industry to develop consensus standards in the interim and coordinate these efforts with the FAA. This will allow the nascent industry to grow in a stable regulatory environment without the threat of arbitrary and burdensome regulations, impacting their ability to innovate. In turn, this will help the United States lead the world in commercial space endeavors. The Act also extends the indemnification risk-sharing structure. Since international law places liability for damages resulting from space accidents on the launching state, all spacefaring nations require some form of third-party liability insurance for the launching entities. The Act extends indemnification to 2025 and requires an update to how the FAA calculates the maximum probable loss associated with these launches. This provision will prevent U.S. launches from going overseas. Other nations overseas have more favorable liability protection, and we have to remedy that situation. The Act also allows for science and permit flexibility by closing a statutory loophole that would have negated an experimental permit once a launch license was issued for the same vehicle design. This provision will foster greater innovation by allowing an experimental permit holder to continue testing while a license holder conducts operations. H.R. 2262 includes a necessary technical definition for government astronauts. Currently, law only allows for two categories for individuals carried within an FAA licensed spacecraft: crew and spaceflight participants. Now that NASA is procuring astronaut access to the ISS, a new category is necessary to outline the roles, responsibilities, and the protections for these astronauts on commercial human spaceflight launch. The Act also closed a loophole created by the 2004 Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act that carved out an exception for spaceflight participants from indemnification coverage. By including them in the provision, spaceflight participants that may participate in a launch as a result of a contest or other means are not burdened with financial exposure above the limits, thereby opening up space to everyone, not just the ultra-wealthy. The Launch Liability Convention, to which the U.S. is a party, places liability for space launch and reentry accidents on the federal government. This act contains a provision that ensures federal courts review lawsuits resulting from accidents, since the federal government is ultimately the responsible party as a result of the treaty, not the states. This provision also prevents venue shopping. This ensures that suits are treated fairly and still allows the application of state substantive law in tort cases filed in federal courts. The Act creates cross-waiver consistency between launches for payloads and commercial human spaceflight. This provision includes spaceflight participants in this cross-waiver requirement to ensure consistency and reinforce the informed consent requirements while still allowing spaceflight participants to file claims in the event of gross negligence or willful misconduct. As lawyers, I'm sure you appreciate the fact that it has been long held by the U.S. courts that such cross waivers of liability do not allow for the waiver of claims of gross negligence or willful misconduct. The Act asks for reports on orbital traffic management, space situational awareness and orbital debris, and compliance with the authorization and supervision requirements of the Outer Space Treaty. Similarly, the Act asks for more information on how the government should treat spaceflight support vehicles and state commercial launch facilities. The information gathered from these reports will inform future congressional action related to commercial space. And this Act also extends authorization for ISS operations and utilization from 2020 to 2024 and beyond. Finally, the House also rolled three other separate bills into the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act before it went to the Senate. These three bills were included as titles under the Act. Title II is derived from H.R. 2261, the Commercial Remote Sensing Act of 2015. Another bipartisan bill, sponsored by Representative Jim Bridenstine and Representative Ed Perlmutter, ensures that the Department of Commerce is able to protect national security while maintaining the United States status as a leader in the development and the operations of remote sensing technologies. Title III is derived from H.R. 2263, the Office of Space Commerce Act, which is sponsored by Representative Dana Rohrabacher from California. It updates the existing office's name to appropriately reflect its duties and streamlines the functions of the office's responsibilities. And the bill also expands the office's responsibilities supporting the administration's positioning, navigation, and timing policy to include the stewardship of the National Space Base PNT Coordination Office. Title IV comes from H.R. 1508, the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act, a bipartisan bill sponsored by Representative Posey and Representative Derek Kilmer in the House, with a companion bill in the Senate sponsored by Senator Patty Murray and Senator Marco Rubio. This codifies the legal principle long accepted by the United States that the freedom to explore and use outer space includes the right of non-governmental entities to remove, take possession, and use in situ natural resources found on celestial bodies. Title IV of the Act and its provisions on space resource exploration and utilization has gained particular attention from the press. Unfortunately, there have been a number of misconceptions about the intent and the legality of Title IV, so please allow me to clarify a few of these provisions. First, Title IV gives an effect to the right to explore and use outer space by establishing under federal law private citizen rights over obtained in situ space and asteroid resources. It does so consistent with U.S. international obligations. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty explicitly recognizes that non-governmental entities, such as private corporations, may explore and use outer space, including the right to remove, take possession, and use in situ natural resources from these celestial bodies. The United States government has long taken this position, all the while recognizing and aware that this view is not shared by all states or commentators. Second, this is consistent with the United States obligations under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty and is not an assertion of sovereignty or jurisdiction over any celestial body. Third, it should also be made clear that in drafting and negotiating Title IV of the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, specifically Section 51303, there was a challenge to what language should be used to give effect to this right. The term obtain was ultimately chosen because it carried no presumption about the technical means by which the resource would be recovered. However, it was never our intent that obtainment would allow a company to remotely sense a resource and then assert a right of possession. Only through physical recovery does this right manifest. Fourth, nothing in Title IV supports the creation of an international body to establish rules and regulations over space resource mining. Doing so is unnecessary and would definitely be counterproductive, undermining U.S. national interests and disincentivizing private sector investment. The purpose of Title IV is to allow state domestic law and customary practice to develop without unnecessarily proscribing international rules. Congress has directed the United States to promote the right of U.S. citizens to engage in commercial exploration for and commercial recovery of space resources free from harmful interference. Such promotion would include the Department of State working diplomatically with other countries to adopt domestic laws and policies that support mutual recognition of space resource flights. But neither the President nor NASA, nor the NASA administrator should promote establishing an international body to govern space resource mining. The U.S. continues to lead the world in space exploration. However, other nations would certainly like to impede that progress for their own benefit by placing the burdensome yoke of an international body around the neck of U.S. innovation. And while there is certainly a place for the U.S. to engage internationally, those efforts should focus on mutually beneficial arrangements. I think the President agrees with this perspective, and that's why he was, quote, delighted, unquote, to sign this bill. And I trust that NASA and the State Department will share in the President's delight and advance this bipartisan and unanimous position, as the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act reflects the hard work of the Congress, the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and the stakeholders who have been engaged all along the way. And despite the enactment of the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, we recognize that more needs to be done. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires the United States government to authorize and supervise the activities of its citizens and companies in outer space. However, a number of new commercial space actors are pushing the boundaries of our existing constructs, and the Act has a number of reporting requirements to address these new private sector developments. This includes reports on orbital traffic management, space situational awareness, orbital debris, and compliance with the authorization and supervision requirements of the Outer Space Treaty. Similarly, the Act asks for more information on how the government should treat space flight support vehicles and state commercial launch facilities. The information gathered from these reports will inform future congressional action related to commercial space. Congress would be well served by waiting for these reports before rushing to act. Once Congress receives these reports, we will evaluate the findings, conclusions, and the recommendations and conduct the necessary oversight to inform future congressional action if it's necessary at all. There are many questions that remain unanswered about these topics and many potential unknown impacts that need to be considered before rushing to a solution that may preclude other more innovative solutions. The House Science and Space and Technology Committee will certainly take the lead on addressing these issues and fulfilling its responsibilities under House Rule 10, which grants the committee black letter jurisdiction over outer space, including exploration and control thereof, unquote. We will also have to evaluate the impact of the recent commercial launch failures going forward. Commercial spaceflight accidents that involve people and those that involve cargo are clearly different. Government missions and completely private activities are equally different. I look forward to reviewing the results of all the accident investigations so that we can decide how best to address these different incidents and efficiently and effectively review future accidents. However we address the commercial launch accidents going forward, we must continue to facilitate innovation, protect personal liberty, promote safety, and remain vigilant stewards of taxpayer funding. As Congress wraps up consideration of arguably the most significant commercial space bill in decades, we still have much more work to do. I'm concerned that to date, Congress and the administration have not been able to reach consensus on the most efficient way to meet NASA's launch requirements. That being said, there should be no doubt that we want to see American astronauts launching on American rockets from American soil and as soon as possible. Thank you. This is a good opportunity to turn to the committee's work toward NASA's Reauthorization Act. The last NASA Authorization Act expired at the end of 2013. This is unacceptable. The House has passed multiple bipartisan authorizations over the last 2 years, one by unanimous consent. This should be an easy bill for the Senate to take up and to pass quickly. The underlying policy provisions and even the most recent authorization passed out of committee are not controversial, and they would provide constancy of purpose as NASA transitions to a new administration in just under 1 year. And I urge every one of you in this room to recommend to your senator and to the Senate to take up consideration of a NASA authorization so that we can present a bill to the President by the end of this year or by, at the latest, the early next year. There is a great deal of promise in the future of space. I know that we'll be able to develop policies that benefit the nation and mankind. If we fail to provide long-term solutions to the issues that our nation faces, we may well lose our leadership in space. China stands ready to fill that leadership void at a national level. Russia and Europe will gladly fill that role from a commercial perspective once again. Our leadership in space shouldn't be taken for granted. If we fail to provide a competitive environment, other nations will happily step forward to fill those shoes. This will lead to an eroded industrial base, a decrease in our national capabilities, declining international influence, and the loss of a skilled workforce. And I, for one, do not want that to happen on my watch. It is up to all of us to find common ground and responsible solutions that meet the needs of our nation and grow the economy and maintain our leadership in space. I'd like to make sure that the children in elementary schools around the country right now become the very next generation of space pioneers. As leaders of the commercial space transportation community, you have an important role to play. I look forward to working with all of you to make the promise of a thriving commercial space industry an absolute reality. And I want to thank you once again for allowing me to come up and speak to you this morning. And I regretfully say that I would stick around for a few questions, except that I'm a space subcommittee chair and I've got a hearing in just a few minutes, so I've got to get back to the Hill. But I want to say God bless you, God bless our space program, and God bless America. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Babin. We certainly appreciate you being here today. I am now happy to introduce Dr. Dava Newman, the Deputy Administrator of NASA. Dr. Dava Newman was nominated in January 2015 by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in April 2015 to serve as the Deputy Administrator of NASA. Dr. Newman is responsible for providing overall leadership, planning, and policy direction for NASA. She also is responsible for, among other things, articulating the agency's vision and representing NASA to the White House, Congress, heads of federal agencies, international organizations, and external organizations. Prior to her tenure with NASA, Dr. Newman was the Apollo Program Professor of Astronautics at MIT. Her expertise is in multidisciplinary research that encompasses aerospace, biomedical engineering. As a student at MIT, Dr. Newman earned her PhD in aerospace, biomedical engineering, and her Master of Science degrees in aerospace engineering and technology and policy. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Deputy Administrator Newman.
Morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure. This is my first ComStack, and I'm really glad to be with you, many colleagues and friends, and thank you, Shanna. To be introduced by NASA's first female Deputy Administrator is my great honor, and I'm just glad to follow in the footsteps. It's a pleasure to go after Chairman Babin as well for his vision and leadership of the Space Subcommittee, who we work with so closely. I'm serving in my first full year as NASA Deputy Administrator. However, my connections to NASA go back the past 3 decades. Administrator Charlie Bolden and we're often asked about what's NASA's strategy, specifically, your strategy for exploration. Well, let me assure you, that commercial space is a key component of the vision of our future. Our intention is to expand our scientific portfolio and to infuse our aeronautics research and technology development efforts with greater resources. At the same time, we'll facilitate the development and success of a very vibrant commercial space industry to provide cargo and crew to the International Space Station and other low Earth orbit destinations. It's been an amazing couple years on the commercial front, with the first crew of astronauts now chosen for the first test flight and commercial mission. Meanwhile, SpaceX and the Boeing company are under contract for our commercial crew services. In the cargo arena, Orbital ATK has resumed cargo delivery to the ISS. I was really glad to be there for the last launch in December, carrying the largest cargo payload yet, and SpaceX is soon to follow. As you know, we also just contracted for our second phase of cargo delivery, all the way through 2024. Our current commitments to SpaceX, Orbital ATK, and the Sierra Nevada Corporation preparing for these absolutely critical missions. Each carrier is contracted for a minimum of 6 missions, so we're really entering our second generation of commercial cargo delivery to orbit, something that's just incredibly extraordinary just standing on its own, but this is just one thing among a huge accomplishments in commercial space on our journey to Mars. Work's already begun on Space Station to make it possible for the new commercial crew vehicles to dock to ISS, and the actual docking adapter is soon to fly up to the station. The commercial crew will enable us to expand our crew to 7 aboard Space Station, make it so we can make use and really maximize the scientific and technology demonstrations to really continue assessing, helping us learn more about human health for space to move us further out into the solar system. Expanding this capability for all the science and technology demonstrations aboard station is absolutely critical. As a former PI myself, I know that you count every hour of crew time to get your experiment done and to test the technologies. So we're really looking forward to that. It's an extremely busy year this year for commercial crew. We have parachute tests coming up, launch pad certifications, to the completion of the spacecraft that are actually going to fly to station. So we're building on the momentum of 2015, really busy 2016, and we're looking forward to landmark achievements by 2017. All these things are making it possible for NASA to expand our human presence beyond low Earth orbit, realize the goal expressed by President Obama to deliver the capability of humans to work, learn, operate, and live safely beyond Earth for extended periods of time. So our country is on a journey to Mars. It's a journey that will bring American astronauts to Mars by the 2030s. And with the progress of commercial crew and other technologies, this journey is already well underway. We say we're in phase 1 in low Earth orbit on the space station. This effort is putting Americans to work, fueling advances in science, technology, education, innovation, medicine, and green energy. Is teaching us more about our universe, and most importantly, about our own planet, Spaceship Earth. We're currently in the Earth-dependent phase of this journey. We're conducting research, developing and testing technologies that will really enable the long-duration missions into deep space. American astronauts are literally taking it to the next level, living on board Space Station, especially with our 1-year mission and the culmination coming up in just less than a month with Scott Kelly coming back down after his 1-year mission. So I'd note that we have an open astronaut call, and the deadline is February 18th. So any of you in the audience, just have a couple weeks to kind of polish up those applications. If you really want to fly on those American vehicles, they're going to be our commercial crew providers. Any takers? So in nearly every state, Americans are working in more than 1,000 companies, over 1,000 companies with NASA's partnerships with commercial companies to deliver the cargo and crew to the station in support of all this important work. Meanwhile, across the board, 80% of NASA's activities are carried out by our partners in industry and at our universities. We're developing more than 1,600 new technologies each year, working with business partners to transfer thousands of products, services, and processes into the market for job creation and economic growth. And the business community is responding. More venture capital was invested in American space industry in 2015 than the sum total of the previous 15 years. So I'd say we just got to keep that momentum going. We're here, we've arrived, but this is really critical. We can do more. So I think we've really made incredible progress in achieving this dual purpose of returning astronaut launches to an American soil while positioning and to create the commercial market in low Earth orbit that creates jobs and grows the American economy. Few would have imagined back in 2010 that less than 6 years later, we're able to say commercial carriers have transported 16,000 kilos, it's 35,000 pounds, of space cargo, and we're just counting. So I'd like to make sure to reiterate that we're firmly on track to return launches of astronauts to the ISS from American soil and American commercial carriers, and that we're succeeding in insourcing American jobs and empowering the American entrepreneurs and innovators to expand the commercial market. More than just mere coincidence that we're able to say that America today is closer than ever before in human history to sending our astronauts to Mars. The President said in 2010, when he outlined the vision that we've been pursuing, I quote, "In fulfilling this task, we will not only extend humanity's reach in space, we will strengthen America's leadership on Earth," end quote. So our investment in commercial space is creating the jobs, it's bringing us closer, sending American astronauts to Mars. This journey is advancing our ability to provide reliable, safe, routine access to low Earth orbit and to conduct exploration beyond LEO. NASA will depend on the capabilities and talents of the companies represented here in this room today for access for our cargo and crew. Next, we'll turn our sights to the difficult and risky challenges of deep space exploration. But in deep space exploration as well, there are many opportunities for the commercial sector, and we're counting on you. We're at the early stages of soliciting input on what these partnerships are going to look like and the technologies and capabilities that we'll need, but they're coming into sharp focus. We're prioritizing, for instance, in the human exploration, we will begin development of cislunar habitat and habitation systems that will enable extended duration human missions around the moon in preparation for humans into deep space. This work builds on the technology and systems testing and demonstrations from ISS. And our next step public-private partnerships really are leveraging additional public sector investment to develop these commercial habitats in low Earth orbit. So public-private partnerships leverage both kinds of investment to help us meet our requirements and will really also foster the growth of the commercial endeavor. So that's what we're counting on, that dual leveraging. It's also really gratifying to see that our Center for Advancement of Science and Space, that's CASIS, which NASA has asked to maximize the use on space station as an international lab, it's reached its capacity based on the crew time from 2015. So we didn't even know that that was possible. It's great to see that exponential growth. We're really at maximum capacity. That's why we got to get that 7th astronaut up there as well, so that we can just do more and learn more. So CASIS has achieved this by drawing on research from commercial companies, the academic institutions, universities, government agencies, and then also growing non-traditional demand. Our milestones, like the 1-year crew mission and the upcoming 7th crew member, as I mentioned, are making it possible for us to get the most out of station science and technology demonstrations. Soon, the Beam Expandable Space Habitat will also be on its way to the station, as well as to demonstrate that new technology. Back in the dawn of the space age, getting a human into space was too risky, too costly for any company to take it on itself. Today, that's changed. We've learned a lot at NASA in the last 58 years. We've been able to pass on much of what we've learned to our commercial partners in the form of our human rating requirements, our critical safety lessons learned, so that now everyone's working hand in hand and the learning is very mutual. All of our partners have different approaches. They're flying different systems, none mandated by NASA. We also want to support the associated technologies and the capabilities that will be necessary to ensure the commercial sector of the economy grows and it can thrive and it can also adapt in response to changes. The innovation of commercial partners helps make possible a wide array of objectives and capabilities that not only NASA, but many other stakeholders really want to achieve in space. We don't intend to be the only customer for LEO access. Other government agencies, as well as other nations, academia, businesses, they're all going to need these capabilities. It's a complex process. Our friends here at the FAA are also very hard at work in the regulatory field. As you've seen, Chairman Babin's remarks, it's a start. A lot has happened. Bills are passed, but there's still a lot more work to do ahead. I'm pleased that at this conference, the commercial space is being discussed by so many fronts, from the technical to the legislative to the collaborative. It's going to take all of us, every single one of us, and everyone we represent here that really this is underway, but let me repeat, the benefits can't be understated. They're huge for our nation. At the heart of this, it's not new. The Space Act found in NASA in 1958 requires us to use commercial services to the extent feasible. But what is new is what is now feasible. U.S. national space policy guiding us currently maintains as one of its key principles, I quote, "A robust and competitive commercial space sector is vital to continued progress in space. The United States is committed to encouraging and facilitating the growth of the U.S. commercial space sector that supports American needs. It's globally competitive and advances U.S. leadership in the generation of new markets and innovation-driven entrepreneurship," end quote. All of this brings NASA in line with a reinvigorated national focus on capability creation and the research and development and testing that will advance our priorities today and give us payoffs in the out years, allowing future generations to have a much greater capabilities to explore. We're committed to a commercial space industry at NASA. In the long run, it's going to increase our human spaceflight capabilities. It's going to strengthen our leadership position in space exploration as it provides us with multiple, redundant, reliable capabilities to access space. And it's going to stimulate the economy and create job-producing engine for America. We're today living in a new era of exploration, and we're really happy at NASA to have so many energetic entrepreneurial partners, as well as partners in government, academia, and the legislative branch, helping us to create what I believe is a very bright future, brilliant future, in fact. I sincerely hope that all of you want to be a part of that future. I know you do. That's why we're all here together today. And thank you for your attention. I'm happy to stay and take questions. But I'm interested in that hearing that's going on.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for that. Steve Brody, I'm with ISU, and it'd be a great pleasure to hear your perspective from the time you've been at the agency on how the agency is doing in meeting whatever diversity goals both the administration and perhaps the agency has, male-female goals and others to bring in more representation throughout American society.
Great, thanks for the question, Steve. It's a passion of mine. I know that we all do our best work when we have input from intellectual diversity, racial, all kinds of diversity, gender diversity. So I think NASA's not where we should be. As a matter of fact, coming from academia, a little surprised, joining the government and saying, oh, looks like maybe 20 years ago. So those are the facts, but we're very cognizant of it, and there's a way to go about this. Again, we just need to be very much more conclusive. If you hear me talk, I talk about STEAMed. I'm a huge proponent of STEM education, and I talk about it almost every day. But the reason I've turned it to STEAMed is because the arts, design, I think we have a new generation of these makers out there, and my message to them is that you're all in. I need every single one of you. I want you all to come join NASA, the government. This is challenging work, but again, we're all in. So I think in terms of changing the conversation, that's really important. And then it gets right up to our government agencies as well. We want to see excellence, first and foremost, and excellent people come in all kinds of shapes and forms. And so we need to just be very diligent about it. And I really hope that we can have some results and change the numbers. But we're working on it, has very top leadership, and I'm completely committed to it. Thanks for the question. You guys are quiet. Yeah, early morning. Well, thanks so much for your attention, and it is my pleasure to be with you all. Look forward to working with you all. Thanks.
David, thank you so much for your great remarks, but more so the tremendous enthusiasm that you're bringing over to NASA. It is definitely noted by the staff and all the folks here in Washington that have had the privilege to work with you. So we really appreciate that. Appreciate you coming today. Next, it's my privilege actually to introduce some great friends of mine. This panel should more be called, instead of Infrastructure for Space Commercialization, it's kind of the Fun Kids panel with the list of all-stars that we have. But it's my privilege to introduce a real good friend of mine, Michael Lopez Alegria. Mike has over 3 decades of aviation and space experience with the Navy as well as with NASA in a variety of roles, including as a naval aviator and an engineer, test pilot. Mike also, spent some time in space as an astronaut. He was a 4-time astronaut and also served on the International Space Station up until just recently, holding the record for the longest time in space on several missions. But really the high point of Mike's career was running the Commercial Space Flight Federation. And truly the saddest day in his career was when he had to give up the reins to a young, inexperienced young man to take over the huge shoes that he filled. So Mike often calls me day in, day out, to talk about those days he had, the 2 years at CSF, and really as the focal point and the high point of his career. So I try to walk him through that from time to time and tell him there was other times. There's good times in space and international missions. So Mike is, after his time at CSF, serves on many boards and an advisor to many people, and also, as I said earlier, a great friend of mine and still an advisor to CSF. Mike, thank you for the great time last night. Appreciate it. Good luck for the next hour.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here, and I have to say, first of all, congratulations to the FAA AST under the steady hand of Dr. George Neild, and to my friends at the CSF under the shaky hand of Eric Stallmer for putting this together. This conference seems to get better and better every year, and I think it's a reflection of the industry that we represent. Before I go any further, why don't you all come on up? John, too, thanks. And the industry keeps getting better and better every year as well, and there are lots of things to point to, but certainly a couple of the marquee activities that have gone on have been NASA's cooperation with industry on the commercial cargo and commercial crew programs. So 10 years ago, who would have imagined this? I mean, we went from PowerPoint to ProxOps, and we're actually delivering cargo to the ISS with 2 commercially built vehicles, which I think is just an astounding development. But, I wouldn't say we have the transportation thing completely nailed yet, but we're getting there. Certainly on the cargo side, I'd say we're there. On the crew side, it's going to be not very much longer. But, in the 15th century, we had sailing ships, and in the 19th, we had the Transcontinental Railroad, but those are great modes of transportation, but today, we still don't really have a destination, a commercial one at least, in space. And so this is an attempt to open a dialogue, a conversation that I hope will continue among this crowd and further afield about what is that next step for commercialization in space. If we're going to help NASA go beyond the Earth-reliant phase to the proving ground of cislunar space, we need to develop those things. And we have a truly star-studded cast here to help talk about this thing from their particular perspectives. It's a diverse group in terms of where their knothole is, and I think we'll all be a lot smarter about where we're going. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Henry Hertzfeld. My job today is actually pretty easy because everybody knows all these folks up here, but I'll just say a few words about each of them. Dr. Hertzfeld comes from GW's Elliott School's Space Policy Institute, where he's a research professor. He's also an adjunct professor at law. He's an expert on national and international legal, economic, and policy issues regarding space. He's written several articles. He's served both NASA and the National Science Foundation in the capacity of an economic advisor. So please welcome Dr. Hertzfeld.
Thank you, Mike. The topic is developing the infrastructure for space commercialization. And so I wanted to start and just talk about building blocks of that infrastructure and take a look at where we possibly really are in doing this. If I can get these slides to work. Oh, there we are. Okay. I've outlined several of the basic building blocks. First, the science, technology that we need to get to space. Over time, the way we've done this, government missions, NASA, DoD, industry supported them, contractual relationships from day one and before, done a great job and very successful, but it's been supply push in economist terms. It's been build it. Build it for government missions. In terms of the private sector, oh, they'll come. They have to some degree, but not nearly what today, anyway, we'd like to see. But there's still a lot of that mentality in the government. We've got neat things to do, there are engineering challenges, and we're going to build them, and it's great. Then there's the economic end of it. There are a lot of barriers to entry into the space business. You need demand, business consumer demand, to really overcome many of those barriers. And those barriers include everything from interest rates to regulatory and legal and international influences. So there's the financial end of it. You need incentives on the fiscal side. You need adequate government, business, and commercial demand, consumer demand, all together. And what's the evidence? The data I've seen shows that, for example, cumulatively over the last, 5 years, 10 years, private investment in space has been a little over $3 billion. It's a lot of money. It pales in comparison to what the government spends, of course, but it's significant. Look a little deeper. About 3/4 of that comes from large corporations, another 10 or 15% from rich individuals. Look a little deeper into what they're spending money on. It's launch vehicles. Why is it launch vehicles? Because we have a government demand for taking things to space station that will continue maybe for another 8 to 10 years. That's the business planning horizon. That's where the money is going. Relatively little is going into building demand for using space. There are interesting things and interesting proposals out there, but that's not where it's really going at the moment. Then there's a legal end. We have to adapt law to our space capabilities. International law and the treaties, and a regulatory environment that is transparent, stable, predictable, et cetera. We heard Representative Babin speak about that a little while ago, and he spoke, and there's no need to repeat what he said. I do think that we're on a trajectory in this country that is becoming more business friendly, but the bottom line is we still have a long way to go. So, next slide, please. So some of the key issues are bringing all of the ingredients together at the right time. And this rarely happens. And in fact, there's an awful lot of luck involved in that. I'm talking politics, I'm talking finance, I'm talking technology. They all have to be ready. They all have to converge. I think we're moving toward that. We're providing incentives for industry to overcome barriers to entry. But again, bottom line, not quite there yet. And we have to recognize that industry recognizes this, we all do. Regulations in space are absolutely necessary for a variety of reasons, meet international obligations, protect public safety, and so on and so forth. But there's a balance. There's a balance as we move ahead. And if we regulate too soon, when we don't even know exactly we're going to be doing in 10 or 20 years in space, we might actually create possible new barriers to entry. If we wait too long, and then all we do is respond to accidents or incidents or other external forces to regulate, then we haven't done our job right either. So finding that balance is critical. I applaud the studies that are going to be done under the new Space Act, and they will help shape the future of how we go about this. United States trends, I've already talked about some of these. We began to change our attitude and truly encourage private sector risk sharing and investment over 30 years ago, essentially in the early 1980s. Progress has been slow, as we know, and incremental. Nothing radical has happened. And the trends are converging. The long-term outlook is promising. And the government does react quickly. Even in the late 90s, Congress added reentry vehicles to the FAA's Commercial Space Launch Act. In 2004, in response to the winning of the X Prize, the Human Spaceflight Amendments. More recently, the H.R. 2262 has a lot of very progressive provisions in it. So we're not stagnant. Congress is not stagnant. In fact, they're remarkably quick in trying to help stimulate the industry. So, wait a minute. Something happened. I pushed a button and all the sound went off. Okay, last slide. But we have to proceed ahead with caution. And I said relative to the rhetoric because you read the newspapers. I've talked with intelligent people who know something about space who think NASA's closing its doors and the private sector is going to do everything. We know that's not true. And in fact, it's even more important that we are still dependent on government investment to stimulate the commercial sector. The law is slow to change, and strong global demand will help other nations as well move ahead. The treaty obligations, again, Representative Babin spoke very well about how we've addressed some of those. There are more. This is going to be a long-term international discussion, but I honestly believe our regulatory changes are shaping the leadership for the future, and most other nations will, in some way or another, adopt similar regulations. But we still have a cultural problem in the United States. We've got the issues of security, export controls, transparency and interagency coordination, and for so many years, it's been an assumption of, let's look at this license and should we issue it or not? Slowly, we have to begin to change that without jeopardizing security, of course, or other important national concerns. We have to change that to a culture of let's issue the license, except rather than let's deny it if we, but only issue it under certain circumstances. Bottom line, strong demand can overcome most barriers. We've had waves of private sector investment in the past. Some have stagnated. In the 80s, it was the Challenger accident really dampened the enthusiasm for doing research and development on the shuttle for obvious reasons. In the technology bust of about year 2000, all of the proposed LEO satellite, particularly telecommunications, new services went sour. We're in a new wave. Let's hope it continues. I think that the bottom line is, though, we've been riding these waves, and even if they stagnate, every new one has been larger and bigger. and I think that will continue well into the future. So with that, I'll pass on to Carissa. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Carissa Christensen. I think, again, you probably know her work very well. The company that she co-founded and is managing director of, the Tory Group, does work for the FAA, for NASA, for DoD, for DHS. They also produce the compendium that Dr. Neal spoke about yesterday. She is really an expert in the field, known both here and abroad. In fact, we're pleased to have her here. She just got off a plane from Paris last night and actually cut that trip short to be with us. And on a personal note, when I came to the CSF, I knew even less than Eric did about Washington, and she was very, very instrumental in helping me and mentoring me about where the pieces lie. Her work is really top-notch, and it's a pleasure to have her. Carissa.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm charmed to be described as your mentor. That's very, it's a little daunting given your career successes. And I'm very pleased to be here talking at the conference today. I have a long history with the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, dating almost from its inception. I think it is one of the most interesting and successful organizations in the space arena. I think it's achieved very significant things over the years, and we're seeing the results of the work of the development of the commercial space economy now. So I'm going to talk about the LEO economy, and I'm going to talk about, as those of you who know me will be not surprised to know, some data and really look at where we are and what that means. I'll kind of walk through the providers in the LEO economy and what's going on there, and I'll talk about 3 building blocks. I'll talk about investment, I'll talk about supply, and I'll talk about demand. That's what we need to have an economy. I want to start talking about investment a little bit, and I want to talk about the kinds of investment that we see. So right now, there's a lot of investment entering the market. Henry alluded to investment in launch vehicles. There's also a very significant amount of investment in satellite systems, in startup satellite systems. Companies like Skybox and Planet Labs and the dozen or so other remote sensing companies that are starting commercially. And they are attracting private investment from venture capitalists in a way that we've never seen in space before. And just those few companies add up to over $1 billion of investment quite recently. So let me talk a little bit about the types of investment. In space, we often start with what I'm going to call advocacy investment. I've debated topics. I could call it, evangelizing investment or aligned or enthusiast investment. But those are investors that fund space ventures because they are connected to space. They believe in space. It's important to them, personal interest, altruism, technology expertise, but for some reason, the key feature is that their investment is defined by the fact that the venture is space-related. So a lot of startup ventures that we see in space fall into this category. A well-known example, of course, is Elon Musk, who speaks often about his affinity for space and his belief it's important, and that as a core to his motivations. The next phase is what I might call strategic investment. And so that's sort of a more typical widespread term of art. The idea there being is that you've got an investor that has a pre-existing related business interest, and so invests in a space venture not only for the financial return, but also for associated or aligned benefits, access to a new technology, improvements of an existing product, a prevention from the entrance of a competitor into the marketplace, ensuring that a new capability doesn't interfere with an existing capability, for example, satellite. So space is usually a key element of the investment, but it's not the only reason for it. But it's key because of the alignment of business interests. And the third piece, the piece that I think is really important for us to pay attention to and really indicative of the potential for economic growth, is financial investment. So that's kind of what we sort of stereotypically think of as investment. People taking, and institutions taking resources and putting them into whatever Capability is the best money-making machine. That's the interesting investment from a space standpoint. That is the transformative investment. Financial investors, so those kinds of financial investors in LEO are still a rarity, and I'll talk about that a little bit, except those startup satellite companies. Those investors are not motivated by the fact that the investment is space-related. The space connection is basically coincidental. Their focus is financial return, and so they've invested several $billion in space, in satellite ventures, startup satellite ventures. So financial investors are going to be attracted to the LEO market, the human spaceflight economy, when they perceive the potential to make money, and their presence is going to be a good indicator of that market maturity and its growth potential. So commercial space activities in LEO have increased quite a lot. The vision is that there are ventures seeking to offer passenger flights and platforms, infrastructure for tourism, for manufacturing, suborbital flights, orbital flights, new destinations, supporting infrastructure businesses to serve a variety of markets, and this is sort of the dream, the vision of the array of activities that we can envision in low Earth orbit. What I want to do is talk about what today's LEO economy does and just share with you quickly some numbers on investment, on supply and demand, segmenting the market looking at suborbital providers, looking at orbital providers of launch, and looking at destination and related business providers. Because there are different levels of investment, and we have different insight into those markets and the demand in those markets. And this is a vision, this is an image that reflects the current providers, the current companies, key companies that create the commercial LEO economy right now. So let's kind of delve into the detail. So suborbital markets, looking at investment in suborbital markets, we've seen advocacy investment by firms, by the founders of those firms. We've seen strategic investment, for example, Northrop Grumman acquired Scaled Composites. And we've seen arguably financial investment, notably by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi, which invested in Virgin Galactic as an example. So the investment side on suborbital has been fairly robust. Suborbital supply, and there are multiple firms developing capability, has developed more slowly than the industry predicted. Multiple providers are working hard on developing suborbital commercial spaceflight capability, but we're years out from initial expectations. Suborbital demand appears fairly robust. So given that this is a new space venture that's not existed before, the Torrey Group did an extensive study analysis of demand and found that right now there's demand that can support something like weekly flights at announced prices, and there's potential for significant growth. And that's buttressed by evidence of demand from ticket sales to date. So many hundreds of potential passengers have actually paid in part or full. That's a great demand indicator. So let's move to the orbital realm. In the orbital realm, investment has been a combination of advocacy investment from founders like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, strategic investment by firms like Sierra Nevada and Boeing, and there's been financial investment as well from venture capital firms sort of following SpaceX, although it's worth noting that SpaceX's business case includes satellite markets, proven markets, as well as human spaceflight. I would argue that NASA is the most important investor in this arena, and that NASA behaves mostly like a strategic investor with some flavor of an affinity investor. And I'm not nervy enough to dictate how NASA should behave when given the next speaker that we're going to hear from. But I will say that in my view, NASA gets better performance from its investments and makes a broader contribution the more it behaves like a strategic investor demanding returns and looking at synergies than an affinity investor or an advocacy investor that is solely looking at investment from an altruistic standpoint. And then commercial supply for orbital spaceflight is relatively robust for firms actively developing capabilities with significant resources from NASA as well as their own investments. Demand for commercial human spaceflight is uncertain. Right now, the most likely customers for commercial human spaceflight to LEO, other than NASA certainly drives that demand, Our sovereign nations, there's widespread interest from launch providers and platform operators in providing services to corporate users, enterprise users, but demand from those users has been consistently slower to develop and at a lower level than expected. And I think that in that arena, there is a need for a curation strategy, that we tend to have the model of going from nothing to everything very rapidly. And I think that NASA and CASIS are working on that curation strategy, and I think that that's going to be very important for commercial entities in the arena. Finally, let's look at platforms and destinations. Their investment is largely advocacy or affinity investment from space billionaires. For example, Robert Bigelow, who created Bigelow Aerospace to build on-orbit platforms. You could argue that Space Adventure's offer of a lunar flyby can be considered a strategic investment in that it's an expansion of its service offerings. But there's not a significant level of, there's certainly not a significant level of investment by comparison, particularly in the financial type. Supply is in the relatively early stages of development on the destinations and platform arena. And demand is highly uncertain, in my view. This is a very, very early stage market. This is very much exploratory in the development of an understanding of demand in business cases. I want to make offer some quick thoughts on the impact of a LEO economy to government. In that at NASA and other agencies, as I said, sometimes there tends to be a frame that the development of commercial space is altruistic, and I would argue that ranging from reducing costs to buying by the yard to being able to engage internationally in different ways, it in fact expands the breadth of options and alternatives in very significant ways. And finally, I want to close with a reminder about the challenges of the emerging economy, specifically emphasizing that those challenges are more business-oriented than technical, that the entrepreneurs involved and their business experience and ability to deliver successful companies make an enormous difference to the outcome, and that as we all know, space is still hard. I look forward to our discussion about the LEO economy of the future and to hearing the other speakers, and I thank you.
So we heard from Dr. Hertzfeld sort of a very big picture about what the kind of key ingredients in the soup that we're trying to make might be, and then from Carissa, what's on the shelves right now in the stores. Now I'd like to zoom in a little bit more and get the two more takes on this from a more specific angle, one from the government and one from industry. So when people say the next speaker needs no introduction, it's overused. His formal title is the Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations at NASA, but everybody here knows him as Gerst. Bill Gerstenmayer's been with NASA since 1977. He's pretty much, and I think the Deputy Administrator may be here, and with deference to her and to Charlie, probably the most important person at NASA, so we should all be paying for some sort of insurance policy on him. I met him back in 1996 in the halls of the Mission Control Center in Moscow, where I think he was still carrying the same backpack that he carries today, when he was an ops lead for one of the Shuttle Mir missions, and he's gone on, obviously, to do very, very impressive work. It's not just a question of technical acumen or program management. I mean, he really has the spectrum covered. A guy that I think is a real honor to be able to introduce, and a huge asset to this country, Bill.
Thanks, Mike. I don't have slides, and there's probably a reason for that. And what that does is that gives me a freedom to talk however I need to talk without having 7,000 reviewers review my remarks before. To present what was presented by the other panelists to you today probably would have taken several months for me to get it through the process. And when I got it through the process, it would make absolutely no sense, but it would be safe to say. So I think, first of all, you ought to step back and you ought to listen to what you heard from the first two panelists. Really, really insightful discussion. So first of all, the discussion about the market and the demand side and the barrier side is a really, really important discussion. And I'm all about trying to kick up the demand side and reduce the barrier side. And we're trying to do that through a variety of ways. I'll describe some of those with you. I think the thing that Carissa talked to you about is also really, really important to think about the investment side, right? We're seeing the enthusiastic investor, the strategic investor somewhat, but we're really lacking on the financial side. There's a lot of promise there. There's a lot of hype again. We've been through this before. We've seen this happen before where we were going to, darken the skies with Iridium and other satellites. The whole launch industry was kicking up, gearing up to do that. And then that market, that demand side never materialized. And then we ended up kind of resetting back. And this is Henry's wave discussion, right? We've been through one wave. Now I believe we're on the crest of another wave as we go through this process. There's a lot of enthusiasm building up on the supply side, on the infrastructure side. But will we be able to generate enough demand? And it can't be just solely government demand. It has to be augmented by private sector demand. That combination of the demand, will that be enough to then kind of push us over or reach that tipping point that actually enables this industry to become more self-sufficient than it is or was in the past? So we'll see where we are in this wave. I'm the eternal optimist, so if we don't break through this time, we'll get another chance at the second wave when it comes after this. But this is a very, very interesting time for us. So let me describe a little bit what NASA's been trying to do and what we've been thinking about trying to do. So first of all, we were able to, with commercial cargo, do things in a very different way. You talk about disruptive innovation. And to have disruptive innovation, there needs to be a new market or a market that isn't the traditional market. So in the expendable launch vehicle world, the market was driven by the high-end, high reliability, extremely high-value satellites that absolutely have to make orbit. That was the market that existed. What we did with Space Station, because our cargo, although important, is not that valuable, we were able to take significant risk on the cargo side and go for low price and essentially very few restrictions from the NASA side. So from the NASA side, I was willing and able to take the mission success risk. The vehicle did not have to absolutely make station. There could be a launch failure. There could have aborted out approaching station. All we had to do was really protect the asset, Space Station. And those were the only requirements that the government placed on this activity. So this allowed a very low-end market that was low cost, very few regulations to get started. That enabled a disruptive innovation to occur in the launch market that would not have occurred any other way. So that was extremely important that the agency was able to go do that with cargo. And it was unique to cargo. It is not the crew case. The crew case is back in the high-end, high reliability, mission success must work, high-end market case. That would not have allowed disruptive innovation to occur, but we allowed it to occur because of the particular type of cargo we were flying. So that was done consciously. We're continuing to grow and mature that and understand how that moves forward. So that's the first point I wanted to make, was to describe kind of what we did and how commercial cargo is different than crew. We're going through an experiment with crew. We'll see how that works as we work with our commercial providers. We now have a requirement where mission success now has to occur. NASA needs to be involved as a government agency. But the beauty now is we can get some pushback from the industry side where they're interested in low cost, some performance, they're looking on return on investment, they're looking at different incentives, and that natural tension between the government side and the private sector is very healthy. I will use that tension to also drive some of our traditional government programs like SLS and Orion. We'll learn things from commercial crew, we'll feed those into SLS and Orion. I'll learn things from SLS and Orion and feed those back into commercial crew. So I think that's a very healthy step. So I think that's the first piece I wanted to talk about. Then the other thing that's unique about Station is not only did it give us this chance to have this unique low-end market, but now it's allowing the demand side to gain a chance to experiment for fairly low cost. They can go to space, and we can now fly cargo to space. We're trying to within 3 months or 6 months. We don't have to, there's no peer review, there's no requirement to go look at that. It's what anybody wants to fly to space station. We give them a free ride to station, we give them free time on station, we give them free data, we give them free power. They can now experiment to see what market opportunities may exist. So this is up to the creativity of the private sector to figure out unique ways to use the properties of microgravity, to use the vantage point of low Earth orbit in a very low risk manner to see if they can create a market. So that's what we're doing with the Center for Advancement of Science and Space through the CASIS organization. That's what we're trying to do through the agency. But it's up to the private sector to figure out a way to use the unique properties of space to a competitive advantage to give them an economic edge over other countries and other industries that are not doing research in space. And we're trying to lower all those activities so they can experiment on station. Then station gets followed up by maybe a private sector station or gets followed up by some real a station's probably the wrong word, but it'll be a single focus kind of activity that is geared to wherever that most market is. And then as Carissa said, then that drives the financial side, and then that's when we start to crest that wave, or the tipping point starts to shift, and we start to see movement towards the private sector. So we're at a very interesting position. We're doing our absolute best with it within the programs to look for innovative and creative ways to go do this. You also heard a very good discussion about it's not only the demand side, but it's also the barrier side. So what can we do to lower barriers? So the agency is reaching out to the Department of Commerce. There's things that don't require financial incentives. There's some legislation things that Department of Commerce is good at doing, maybe tax incentive things, intellectual property rights, maybe a microgravity free zone. Last year at this conference, I talked about taxing all the launch providers to create a venture capital fund for new investment. I got no response from that, so I couldn't understand why you guys were awake or not awake last year. So I'll bring it up again this year to see if you're listening. But we need to figure out a way we create maybe a venture capital pool that's available for microgravity research that can actually benefit the supply side. Because if we just build the supply side and we assume that the government demand will be there for perpetuity, forever, it's not going to happen. We need to bring the private sector in line. They need to see that benefit. We see some of it in the Earth observation area, but I think there's other areas that you can experiment with and see. And we see that in the pharmaceutical areas, and some of the things were listed on Carissa's charts. So with that, I wanted you to just step back and see what we're trying to do on the government side to enable the private sector to do what it can do uniquely, but yet the government has the resources, the financing. We can create this innovation engine. We can create an environment where disruptive innovation can occur. That's our role on the government side. So NASA with the FAA and with the Department of Commerce and other government agencies, we're going to figure out a way to keep lowering those barriers to let the private sector move forward. So you ought to come out of here. This is mostly the supply side, this is mostly the transportation side, but we need to start reaching out to that other community, and we're trying to do that very effectively through CASIS. And there's several conferences that I think you might be well served in to go listen to and see what the market really needs. What does tourism really need? What do they really want? And then we need, collectively as a group, to figure out how to meet that market to move forward. So with that, I'll be welcome to answer any questions and have a good discussion with you. So thanks.
Okay, and so to represent the industry side, we have asked John Elbon to join us. So the reason is, obviously there are a lot of industry voices out there, but I think a really important debate or question in this debate is, how can we stimulate a commercial company to do things when that commercial company is not owned by Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? In other words, when there isn't that advocacy piece, when you actually have to satisfy shareholders in a big corporation. And obviously, Boeing Corporation is pretty much the gorilla in the room here in that regard. So John is the Vice President and General Manager of the Space Exploration Division of Boeing's Defense Security and Space Division. He's been in that job since 2011. He's responsible for the program for the ISS support, for commercial crew, and also for SLS. So he's got a pretty wide field of activity. He's been in charge of ISS as the Vice President Program Manager at Boeing, and also was key in negotiating and executing the early commercial crew development Space Act agreement. So please welcome John.
Thanks, Michael. It's an honor to be here today with this panel. It's a good bunch. In coming at the end of the line, it's a good opportunity to summarize and foot stomp some of the points that have been made. I think the biggest point that we heard from each of the previous panelists was that we're in an inflection point between focusing on supply and moving towards focusing on demand. And that's clearly what it's going to take to really set this whole thing in motion. Professor Hertzfield talked about that, and Carissa did a good job of talking about that, and so did Gerst. You know, Boeing is, I liked Carissa's spectrum of investors, from evangelical, I think was the term, to financial investors. Boeing is clearly near the financial investor end of the spectrum. We have the technical capability within the company to develop an infrastructure in low Earth orbit. Certainly we have the financial resources if there's a business case that closes. It's also important to us from the perspective of it's in our DNA. Boeing is celebrating this year our 100th year as a company. And if you look at where aviation's gone in the last 100 years, it's pretty amazing. And as we look forward to the next 100 years, it's pretty clear that not being involved in space, in space transportation, is going to be critical to the future of the company. So there's that kind of a push to be involved, but at the same time, there's shareholders of the company that expect and demand a return on whatever investments the company makes, and so that becomes an overarching kind of driver as we move forward. So everybody has talked about the supply, and I thought I would show a chart just of the supply that we're building. As an industry, this is kind of what gets us going. It's what we've focused on since the beginning of space travel, is building vehicles that do things and take people places. And certainly there are commercial providers now, 2 providers delivering cargo already, another provider in development, and 2 providers working on crew transportation. So the supply capability is there. I think as an industry we need to work on getting the costs down so that as the demand comes up, the costs can come down, and there's a point there. But it's really been a good effort, as it was described, over the last decade to get the transportation system in place and that infrastructure. Chris also mentioned that we're just starting on destinations, and that's another important piece of the infrastructure. Space station is there. If you took space station out right now, there would be no place for all the transportation to go to. So it's incredibly important that station is there for a while longer to get this whole thing started and to be the incubator for the demand activities, as Mr. Gerstenmaier mentioned. Bob Bigelow and his company were mentioned. There's certainly been cultivating interest in a destination beyond ISS. And I think importantly, working on a business model that involves countries as customers to support a station like that. There's another couple of concept drawing, little CAD pictures I put on there. We're working internally on an idea of a Skylab sort of vehicle that you could build out of a couple barrel sections from the SLS that are coming off the welding tools in MAF. It's actually a bunch of volume and something like that. And with a single launch on SLS, we could put a station into orbit that would be simpler than the space station, theoretically more cost-effective, and provide an outpost in low Earth orbit. So, you know, the technology to do that is not that challenging. The business case is incredibly challenging. The team of 4 or 5 people I've got working on this, I have to keep pushing them to work on the business case. They keep defaulting to defining what this thing looks like from an engineering perspective, which is the fun part, but it's also, in this whole scheme of things, relatively the easy part. So I thought I would just rough order magnitude run through a business case. So The U.S. spends about $2.7 billion a year on operating the International Space Station. The international partners, another 1.2 or so. So roughly, it's $4 billion a year that's spent on operating and maintaining the International Space Station worldwide. About 1.5 of that is transportation. So if you just say we could have a smaller station, become more cost-effective, work the transportation costs. Let's say we could get that down to half of that, or $2 billion a year, just to pick a number. What would it take to develop and build a destination like this? Well, to give you a rough sense of that, Starliner is the Boeing plan to do the development of Starliner is order of magnitude $2.5 billion or so. So I'll just pick a number that a station like that concept would cost, and I'll say $5 billion. There's some launches in the Starliner that we wouldn't have to do, and some different kind of verification. Let's say it would take $5 billion to develop the vehicle, and then $2 billion a year for transportation and ops, just to have some numbers to work with. So if I took that to the Boeing board and said, hey, I'd like to invest $5 billion in building this station, they would look at me. They would. So the idea would be we got to have a return on that investment. That magnitude of investment is not unusual for the company. A commercial airliner costs a couple times, 3 times that to develop. But there's a big market and a pretty assured ROS on that. So this is a pretty risky thing. The minimum really return would be about 15% or so that I'd have to demonstrate. So if it was $5 billion, that'd be about $750 million a year that we'd have to show as a return on this kind of investment. So if you add that 750 to the $2 billion of ops, you're talking $2 to $3 billion of revenue that has to be generated each year to cover an investment like this of an on-orbit destination. So that's a lot of money, $2 or $3 billion a year. And if you look at the kinds of money that's being spent privately on R&D on space station, there's a pretty significant gap between where we are today and where we need to be to have a plan like that. Just to give you a sense, Boeing spends about $3 billion a year on R&D. Procter & Gamble spends $2 billion. Amgen spends $4 billion. That's their total R&D budget. So getting a percentage of that applied to something like this is a challenge. So what kind of things, where can that kind of revenue come from? There's some good research being done on station today. Here's 4 examples, and it's mostly biomedical stuff that I chose here. The one about treating osteoporosis, which is the commercial biomedical testing and development, is about $1 billion a year business for treatment of osteoporosis, that drug that was developed through research on station. There's protein crystal growth experiments being done. There's a somewhat promising drug that's in testing in Osaka, Japan for treating Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is an awful disease. And if we find a cure for that, that'll be, I'm sure, be a good business. And then other things that's being done on station. But those are nowhere near the kind of revenues that we need. So I think we need to look at sovereign nations. I mentioned the model that Bigelow Aerospace is doing. One of those nations being the U.S., of course, but other nations around the world that would be interested in using this space station for research. The kind of holy grail of this whole thing will be if we find some material or manufacturing process that can only be done in space. And interestingly, CASIS has got a few things that they're pursuing. Just to kind of excite your interest a bit, there's folks talking about a new silicon carbide wafer that would be used in microprocessors, and the manufacturing process for this can really only be done in absence of gravity. There's an exotic fiber that's being looked at that would increase the speed of fiber optic cables. Interestingly, that this would be of interest to folks that do trading on the stock exchanges. Getting your trade in just that much quicker apparently can make a difference. There's discussion of doing 3D printing of organs using tissue, and that kind of a process could work in microgravity where the organ would be put together before it started growing and was able to withstand. So, those are in the infancy, but something like that that could only be done in space is the kind of catalyst that we need to make this happen. Certainly R&D, there's accelerated disease models that are done in space. Some of these examples here leaned on that. There's tech demos that need to be done for our missions beyond low Earth orbit. Space tourism is an augmentation, I think, to whatever we can come up with as a business case. Anyway, all these things need to be pulled together, and we need to somehow create a revenue stream that's single-digit billions as a minimum to close a business case that would allow us to then put this kind of capability in orbit and really get going. We need to find investors, some of the users for this kind of research. I mentioned governments. I think tax credits could be a big deal. We enjoy in this country the largest corporate tax rate in the world. 50%. If we could get tax deductions, it could cut the cost of developing that vehicle in half. And so those kind of things I think need to be discussed. Anyway, I think by far the most important thing is to work on this revenue stream, and that's where we as a community need to focus on during this next wave, as has been described, is engaging not just NASA but other government agencies and industry in stimulating that kind of a development of the revenue stream. And then the technology and the ability to do that, and certainly the desire, will follow, and we'll be in good shape. Those are my thoughts. Thanks. I look forward to discussion and questions.
So that was a little bit sobering from the demand perspective, I'd say. I have some questions that I've prepared, but I would really encourage you to approach the microphones while I kick off this discussion among the panelists, because I know there's some, this is a real brain trust up here, and it's an opportunity to really dig into this a little bit. So, John, your comments, I was listening to the possibilities you were mentioning, and I'm wondering, this is actually for anybody who wants to chime in, but John, your comments about what potential revenue streams might be, it didn't seem like all, certainly, or many of them were really required a human-tended capability. So is this, I mean, obviously we have the example of an economy, a very robust one in the satellite industry. Is our next step going to just be a similar robotic endeavor that's in low Earth orbit that might be a precursor to a human-tended capability, or are we in a position to try to make that leap directly? I guess, Chris, I'd like to ask you to leap in on that question first.
I think that the framework of saying what should the architecture look like as a first question is the wrong framework. That is a government-driven, sort of centrally planned and designed model. And so I don't think you can answer that question without looking at it in the broader context of who are the customers, what are the users, what's the intent. So if I were trying to, if I had to design an architecture now and use my today's investment well, I would put more emphasis on flexibility to go in either direction, given how the market evolved, than even if it was more cost efficient to make the choice of one or the other right now.
Anybody else on that?
I would agree. I think the beauty of a demand pull scenario is we would design whatever architecture or approach was the most cost effective to meet that demand. Clearly, if there was a manufacturing process that could happen in 15 minutes, a suborbital flight would be the most cost effective way to approach that. If it was one that could be done in an automated way, maybe over a couple weeks we could launch a vehicle that would stay on orbit for a couple weeks and the automated process would happen and it would return. If it's a process that requires a lot of human intervention to really make work, then we'll have to have at least a human-tended kind of capability. But the beauty of when we get to the spot where demand is driving it is then we can design an architecture that's the most cost-effective way to meet that demand.
I just need to change my answer. What I meant to say, Mike, was astronauts are the most important part of space.
Thank you for that insightful correction.
Yeah, I'd like to add something too. I think we got to be really careful. We don't think of the next space station as this space station. I don't think we're ever going to build another facility. In fact, I know we won't without a shuttle kind of capability of the magnitude of what we got with this space station. So I think we've got to come away from that model. I think we also have to think pretty creatively how we can address some of the issues that John talked about. He talks about a transportation cost as separate from the facility cost. I'm not sure they have to be separate. Look what the Russians do with the Progress vehicle. After the Progress vehicle has accomplished its cargo delivery and is ready to do disposal, it will typically do a 2 or 3 week mission afterwards, collecting Earth imaging, looking at some other stuff, some radiophonic activities, maybe even some laser comm stuff. All kinds of things are occurring with that vehicle afterwards. We can do exactly the same thing with our cargo transportation. We've been talking to Orbital, ATK, and Cygnus. What can you do with your vehicle after the mission? What can we do with a Dream Chaser after the mission? What can we do with a CST-100 after its primary mission is done? Can there be a separate mission? Can we put maybe 2 CST-100s together or put 2 Dragons together and do some things? I think we've got to be very creative and again take station, but use the fact that station is paying the primary cost for the transportation, and then look at creative ways of using that infrastructure or that transportation piece to bridge into the future. So I think we've got to break that paradigm. Don't assume what we need. That's the old model. The new model is listen to the demand that's coming from the demand side and take what we've got and figure out ways to innovatively use what we've got to meet that demand and let them experiment and then push that next step of demand. So I think we've got to be very careful with this model that was described. I think I can drive down the vehicle cost, I can drive down the transportation cost, and I might be able to get enough where the demand, although very small at the beginning, might be enough to satisfy, we would call it a meager station by government standards, but it still may be that piece that then lets us build and create that demand to see what's really available.
Just a little footnote. I mean, if we look at history, we've always preceded humans with robots and with robotic activity. So we're looking maybe 10, 20 years at least ahead with many of these proposals, but humans are expensive, and as long as that is still one of the most expensive endeavors, probably we'll start with some sort of robotic experiments, and then if it's cost effective, whatever that demand would be, and you can use humans to do it, we then move to that. But we also don't know what the state of robotic technology is going to look like in 20 years.
John, would you mind identifying yourself and your affiliation?
Sure, John Olson from Sierra Nevada Corporation. Building on the excellent foundation that you've laid, we've progressed from cargo to crew, and in looking at the stated desire for NASA to focus and extend what we've learned on ISS as the cornerstone of exploration, but focus more on the beyond LEO and have a greater commercial presence in the development and exploitation of LEO. What are your thoughts, both as a group and perhaps individually, on the next step from cargo to crew to perhaps privatization or commercialization of the space station and its operations in and of itself? So looking at it as an integrated enterprise.
Couple things. This is a good discussion. First of all, I'm not sure that, again, the cost of operating the current space station and the international agreements and all the other things we do, I think it makes it very difficult to think of that station becoming private in its sense. Now that being said, I think you can operate the ISS along with some other private space stations at exactly the same time, and they're not mutually exclusive, and there needs to be some kind of handoff. So I think we need to go look at that. And then in terms of discussing what's potentially there commercially, again, beyond low Earth orbit, I think, again, we can use the cargo model for resupply beyond low Earth orbit. If we have needs for cargo in around the moon, we can definitely go right to that cargo model, and we don't need to develop a government capability to deliver cargo to cislunar space or the proving ground where we're going to be. So I think we can short circuit that. But in creating a demand or seeing a demand beyond low Earth orbit, I don't see that yet. Where I see the private sector being most helpful to us is in low Earth orbit. If we can create that demand so there's now an infrastructure that's supported by not only the government but also by the private sector, then I can leverage that, or that frees up dollars for us to go do activities beyond low Earth orbit, because there's not quite yet. I mean, if we're struggling to find a demand in low Earth orbit, we're going to struggle pretty hard to find a demand, I believe, beyond low Earth orbit. And the thing I think we got to be careful of is a lot of times, Carissa said it very good, we jump right to the technical solutions without thinking about the financial and the other solutions. So we envision, asteroid mining, and we envision propellant depots, we envision all this wonderful stuff. Those are all great technical solutions. I don't know that there's a financial backing behind those. What's the unwritten assumption in all that is there is some huge demand for whatever those resources are that are going to be acquired by the private sector in beyond low Earth orbit, and I have not yet seen that demand. We're still struggling to even find some of the demand that John talks about in low Earth orbit. So again, I think we need to be careful we don't think of these as either or, but I think there's going to be some transition, there's going to be some movement in this direction. I also think station needs to be extended beyond 2024 if we look at that, or not, then there needs to be a real sense of urgency today, even if station gets extended beyond 2024, to start pushing this demand side to see what is really available. So as I pushed hard last year, you'll hear me talk a lot in other forums, we really, really need to work on this demand side. So I say it's cargo, crew, and now we're looking on the demand side. And it's really not NASA to build that demand, but NASA to be an enabler to let others on the private sector discover where they can make a market from what we see.
Anybody else want to comment? Jim?
Hi, Jim Caravala, Shackleton Energy Company. Hello to many friends in the room and on the stage. Listening to the conversation today, I feel like slightly Groundhog Day, or I'm talking to a kid who has a history book, a book on economics, a book on basic finance, a book on how to build business sitting on the desk in front of them, and we refuse to open the book. Like, bad industry. And we're not even learning the lessons from past days. We are asking the questions, what is the demand? What is the market? And then we follow on with the statement, using what we have. Using what we have is a world away from actually closing the business model on markets that can sustain what we need to do. And there are markets that require tens to hundreds of billions of dollars of activity going on in space. The first descriptor, or the first paradigm of that, it was the communications industry, transporting low energy bits from geostationary orbit to the ground. Now we may have the remote sensing sector. The next one is likely to be power. We have a planet with 7 to 10 billion people over the next 30 to 50 years in terms of population growth. We have urgent issues on global energy in the terawatt scale. We have urgent issues in the distribution and access of freshwater desalination. These are examples of terrestrial markets that will need significant activity in space. If we talk about, for example, space-based solar power as a driver, there are a number of architectural and technical challenges why that is such a big, difficult elephant to crack. But we in the industry, in the space industry, are the only group on the planet that can think of that solution. As an example, again, we're the only ones that can lead, and yet we are here, navel-gazing, year after year, on what can we do incrementally with the pieces of technology that we have. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to really wake up, because years and decades are passing by, and we ask ourselves the same questions. We need to mobilize in 10, 12 figures or more to serve markets that desperately need what we have. That's just my comment.
Response?
My response would be that the disconnect, when there's a disconnect between the business case and the available investment, then that leads me to go down the path not of saying what are we doing wrong from a policy standpoint, but really does the business case close? What is the distance between the business case and the investment? So the massive energy needs that we as a nation and as a globe will have over the coming decades and centuries, none of us doubt, none of us dispute. The technological capability for space solar power systems, as an example, to serve those needs is absolutely there. There are several studies. I worked painfully on a couple of them in the 1990s too, the Fresh Look study and the CERT study, and the business case doesn't close. It just doesn't. So that to me, the idea of mobilizing tens of billions of dollars is unrealistic unless we're talking about government expenditure. And I don't think at this point that's an appropriate role for government. I think that the government's view toward commercial space should be a benign and enlightened, self-interested one. I think we get the best decisions when our policymakers are not saying, how can we entirely align ourselves to create new markets, to create new businesses? Frankly, NASA, which is wonderful at many things, is not good at that. I think that we get the best policies and we get the best outcomes when our policymakers say, we are open to the idea that industry can enable capabilities and let us do the job that we're trying to do more efficiently, more effectively, or less expensively. That's when you get people aligned, that's when you get people engaged, that's when you get people making good decisions. So I applaud and embrace the idea of a visionary view of markets and the development of markets, but I think that it's got to be driven by the financial returns for really transformative capabilities, and I don't think, my personal opinion is, there's right now on power, we're still in the exploratory stages.
Okay, I mean, just to comment on that, thanks for the comment. We can't even assume that we can go forward with even thinking with any of this if it's not completely financially based. It has to be a totally robust financial consideration. And it's naive to even think that we have a conversation where anything is not. But we do know that we're spending $6 or $7 trillion on total energy needs today as a species and as a civilization. How do we get the net present value of that total architectural build and operations and the new investment of several $100 billion a year in energy infrastructure? How do we start channeling some of that into the fundamental R&D to push up the TRLs of what we need to get into space, to give us in maybe 20 to 40 years the strategic foothold to have the option to have these alternative energy sources? Again, as an example, I'm not totally advocating space-based solar power as the be-all and end-all, but if we're looking in the industry for a real market that has a real demand for a product where you know there are customers, this is as good as any to try and crack the nut, because looking at space-based solar power as a non-viable business case, I'm right with you there, using the assumptions terrestrially that we've made. If we're trying to launch everything from the ground up, it doesn't close. If we're trying to assume current technical launch capabilities, it doesn't close. But we're very good in, as a civilization and species, of solving problems to enable mass production of these kind of technologies that previously would have just been experimental or prototype. So the way, Kristen, you answered the question is indicative again of how we are all talking to ourselves in the industry. We need to bring in oil and gas, the mining sectors, the energy downstream supply sectors into the conversation intimately and treat ourselves as part of a supply chain, just like the space segment of the SATCOM industry does. So I think we need a different way to think about how to ask the questions of where is the demand. With that, I'll shut. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Sure, Henry, go ahead. We don't have, we have one more question I want to get to, and then we've got to
Just a quick thought on the response. I mean, long-term visions are great, but when you're talking finance and you're talking investment, you need to prove that case incrementally. There have been solar power proposals going way back to the 70s. Obviously, technology has changed. That industry has changed. But the oil and gas companies do have money. Why aren't they investing in space? Why can't you make some sort of incremental small business investment that starts the process. I know there have been thoughts on that, for example, providing power in space to future operations there as a commercial activity, rather than thinking about solving the Earth's problems today. Build on it on things you can afford to invest in or other companies can afford to invest in is the way to start. And if that space doesn't close, it's never going to start.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, sir, last one.
Hello, yes. Steve Brody from ISU. Primarily for Gerst or John, but if anybody has comment, we're about to be inundated, our society, with one of the most significant financial expenditures in the marketing and promotion world. Super Bowl is coming up this weekend. And obviously, we got a lot of creative talent on the art side of the world and commercial side of the world. Will we see, if you can speak to it, an ISS-based commercial during the Super Bowl? And if not, is there any impediment in the current structure that prevents the ISS from being at the disposal, so to speak, with appropriate arrangements, at the huge marketing and promotion appetite of this capitalist country we have?
I don't know of any ads that are coming up for the Super Bowl. That would be neat if we did. I will tell you that next year the Super Bowl's in Houston, and although I doubt seriously the Texans will be playing in it, that would be cool if they were. There's not necessarily as ads during the game, but there's a lot of activities planned around the Super Bowl for people that are visiting Houston to come down to the Johnson Space Center and get a shot of space as they're a part of that. It certainly is a good marketing opportunity. I imagine it costs a lot of money. I haven't really checked into what it costs to run an ad during the Super Bowl, but it's a big audience.
We've done some things. We've had some things at All-Star games, some baseballs. So I think we've actually flipped a coin to start a football game, and it may have actually been a Super Bowl. I'd have to go back. We'll have to go pull our records. But we may have actually participated in some of those activities. So we've done that. I think what we need to do is we also need to, if I go on the street or I go ask folks on airplanes, do they know that there's a crew on board space or in space? The typical answer is, well, NASA's out of the space business. And so I think we've got a large problem in front of us. It's great to go do the Super Bowl things and the ads and the other stuff, but we as individuals really need to get the message out about what we're doing. We've had 2 to 3 people living off the surface of this earth for 15 years. That's really changing the way that we're doing business. There's kids today that have grown up and gone through school that have known no other future of where there's somebody living off this planet. Those are big things. The research that we're doing on station is really important. Some of the pictures that John showed, and there's a lot more. There's a Benefits for Humanities book. We ought to be describing those things. Those are real. So I think we need to not be debating the finer points of all these pieces about which one is better or this one is better than that one. We ought to be discussing this as a whole, talk about the market is there, and turn it over to the innovative side, turn it over to other industries, turn it over to oil and gas. We ought to be bringing in whoever we can, expose them to what we're doing, and figure out a way we can leverage their energy, their power, their financial prowess to keep what we're trying to do in space moving forward. And I think we also have to be extremely nimble. If you look at the communication satellite industry, it was unbelievably cost prohibitive to drag fiber across the ocean. So there was no question that satellites should have waxed that industry. There should have never been fiber drug across the ocean, but we were so slow in getting that started. We had so much problems that we allowed fiber to grab a foothold and go do that. Same thing in the iridium discussion I had earlier. Who would have thought we would have the money to go stick up all these cell towers all over the world to provide cell coverage when you could easily get it from a satellite above you? There was no infrastructure needed. All you needed was a satellite. But we as an industry were so slow in doing that, we got waxed by a terrestrial market that could turn and deliver faster. So the message here is we have to innovate faster and out-innovate what's going on. The same thing happened with electrophoresis on board space station. They were looking at manufacturing drugs, genetic techniques came online, and electrophoresis lost. So we could create a 99% pure insulin on orbit. They could create a 98% pure insulin through genetic engineering. That won because they could turn to the market faster and be responsive. So we as an industry need to figure out how we're responsive to that market if we're going to stay ahead and broaden the reach.
I want to follow up on that with a success story where space has done very well compared to terrestrial. Direct-to-home television started out to provide TV to, in the US, to the 30% of people that couldn't get cable. The cable industry expanded. Pretty much everybody in the US can get cable now. But still, direct-to-home television is the biggest space segment there is, about $100 billion a year. Why is that? Well, the cable industry helped by doing a terrible, terrible job. But direct-to-home television won on customer service and won on programming, and now competes head-to-head with a terrestrial technology. So it is absolutely possible, and I think it would be nice to have a positive note as well.
Yep, that's right.
Well, look, I want to, on behalf of the audience, thank each of you, John, Bill, Carissa, and Henry, for taking time out of your schedules. It's been very illuminating. Again, this is just what I hope is the beginning of a much, much longer discussion. Folks like Jim, anybody else in the room, we welcome you in future fora like this. There's talk of having a similar panel at the Goddard Symposium. So thanks again for the panelists, and thank you for your attention.
I want to thank LA and the rest of the panel members for facilitating a very important, provocative discussion on our future in space. At this time, we'll take a networking break. We'll come back at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock with our next panel. And also, I want to mention, as you're in the hallway, please take advantage of the exhibits that we have out there. Check those out, and we'll see you back here at 11.